Good evening. I started reading this a while ago and I just rediscovered that I was reading this. So this is going to be chapter 3 of God is Red by Deloria. Chapters 1 and 2 went over the American Indian movement and left me with a deep feeling that these movements actually did create some changes. And number 1, for Native people finding their voice, finding their empowerment, finding each other. It's a big part of AIM. But since then, Standing Rock has happened, which brought together Native peoples, I think, in the strongest way and strongest unity since colonization began. Chapter 3 of God is Red by Deloria. The religious challenge. Indian activists holding religious ceremonies in the BIA building, concluding their stay by looting the building, seems incongruous and ridiculous unless we probe deeper into the nature of the relationship between Indians and whites. Indian activists accused of fomenting the destruction had a rather weak reply. What about the rape of the North American continent, the destruction of tribal cultures, the wasteful use of human beings, the deprivation of rights to a helpless minority? Do not these crimes make the destruction of a building pale in significance, they asked? Do they? In one sense, the capture and destruction of the BIA headquarters was a historic anachronism. Watts burned in 1965. The urban areas seethed and burned following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Was not the occupation of a federal building in the nation's capital an event dreadfully out of time? Was not the sacking of the BIA, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, and the occupation of Wounded Knee the final spasm of the rugged 1960s, when any type of change was considered beneficial, and the institutions of society were considered not only obsolete but malignant? Perhaps it was the last hurrah of an era when people could thumb their noses at established authority without fear of painful reprisal. But the Indian incidents must also be seen within the context of the Indian experience in this nation's history. And in that context, the Indian movement raised an entirely different kind of question, that of religion, rather than the equal enforcement of the law. There certainly was an aspect in which the Indian protests were events of the 1960s. Although occurring in 1972 and 73, since 1968, the major Christian denominations had been pouring funds into social movements of all kinds. They believed deeply in the militant interpretation of Black power as continuous confrontations, and grants were made to organizations within the respective minority groups that they were sure would produce the desired protests. A group that snapped and snarled about its social problems stood a better chance of receiving funds from the churches than did a group that calmly and carefully articulated a problem that they hoped to solve. That makes me wonder how many churches might have been part of COINTELPRO. Back to the text. Church officials often gauged their relevancy in proportion to the violence of the groups they were funding. Any church not receiving its share of frothing at the mouth demands for money felt isolated from the great events of the American social movement. Thus it was that when AIM, the American Indian Movement, captured a dormitory in Augustana College in Sioux Falls and presented a set of demands carefully worked out by sympathetic Lutherans in secret sessions, the Lutheran churches eagerly embraced the Indian cause. And while they had not been overly enthusiastic about helping the blacks during the civil rights movement, some churches felt that they could get the same kind of action from the Indians without taking a position on a social movement that would antagonize their church members. Many Lutherans were ecstatic when informed by Indians that they were guilty of America's sins against the Indians, and they embarked on a massive program of fundraising to pay for their alleged sins. But they were not the only victims, because the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Congregationalists all gleefully responded to the accusation that they had been responsible for nearly all of the problems of American Indians. They also decided that they could purchase indulgences for these sins by funding the Indian activists to do whatever they felt necessary to correct the situation. By early 1971, almost every major Christian church had set up crisis funds to buy off whichever Indian protesters they might arrange to have visit them. Confrontations escalated as each group sought to become more relevant than its competitors, and the path toward destruction was clearly visible to everyone. In a real sense, Christian churches bought and paid for the Indian movement and its climactic destruction of the BIA headquarters, as surely as they had written out specific orders to sack the BIA on a contractual basis. Not every Indian protest, however, was inspired by the financial rewards to be gained from the churches by playing the protest game. Many of the incidents were valid protests Sorry, I have to turn the heat on. I'm in Fort Bragg, California, not far from the beautiful Pacific Ocean. It's chilly here. So, not every Indian protest, however, was inspired by financial rewards to be gained from the churches by playing the protest game. Many of the incidents were valid protests by a people who had suffered too much for too long. Even more younger Indians had seen in the civil rights movement that the institutions of this country responded only when there is a threat to their property or when disorder in their lives forces them to confront problems that have not been solved for generations. Yet the civil rights issue was peripheral at best when understood in the Indian context. The different tribal groups suffered discrimination and prejudice. Generally. But more specifically, the broken treaties meant immediate hardship for the different communities. Could young Indians enter a civil rights movement and press for removal of discriminatory hiring practices while enjoying preference under federal law for employment in tribal programs based on treaties and agreements? Major institutional differences really did exist among American racial minorities. Few Indians ever accepted the premises of the civil rights movement. If the tribal chairman demanded the persecution of the Indian militants following the departure from the destroyed BIA building, It was a weak response compared to tribal reactions on being asked to join in the civil rights movement and marches half a decade earlier. That the basic goals of the civil rights movement could not attract more than a handful of Indians at any one time should give pause to everyone. What was it that turned Indians off, other than the fear that they might be identified with blacks as a minority group? American history gives us a partial answer and allows us to raise certain questions that must be asked. The civil rights movement was probably the last full-scale effort to realize the avowed goals of Christian religion. For more than a century, the American political system had proclaimed the brotherhood of man as seen politically in the concepts of equality of opportunity and justice equally administered under the law. Equality under the law, however, was a secularized and generalized interpretation of the Christian brotherhood of man. The universal appeal of individuals standing equally before God, now seen as people standing equally before the law and secular institutions. While the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, NAACP, Legal Defense, and Education Fund fought a series of brilliant court battles leading up to the great Supreme Court decisions, in the background certainly lurked the great Christian message of the brotherhood of man. A majority of Americans rejected this secular version of brotherhood and sought to prevent its realization because of the long-standing attitudes that people of color were necessarily inferior. When the struggle in the South reached the point of open boycotts and violent protests, it was the Black Christian church leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Andrew Young, who spearheaded the movement by translating Christian doctrines into political tools of resistance and eventually conquest. In large measure, the civil rights movement was a movement that found its ideology, strategy, and meaning in Christian religious doctrines. King's famous letter from jail in Birmingham was not addressed to the political leaders of the South or to the liberals of the North, but to the Christian church leaders of the South, who were intent on reducing the Christian religion to a comforting and spineless recital of creeds. There had to be a point in Western history at which the avowed beliefs of the Christian religion were placed on the agenda to discover if they could become a reality. Could Western Christianity practice the tenets that all people are created equal and that thou shalt not kill? The civil rights movement became the acid test in the field of domestic relationships. Before the civil rights movement, however, one must look at the Nuremberg trials as the moment of history in which Western Christianity achieved its greatest influence. In those trials, the victorious Allied nations presumed to speak for all of civilization and judged the Nazi leaders not as losers, but as those who had violated the basic tenets of civilized and religious existence. In setting themselves up as judges, the Western nations had first to overlook the atrocities of their Russian allies, and secondly, affirm before all societies that they themselves stood sinless before all and before history and were fit to judge. After the Nuremberg trials, it became more or less inevitable that the Western nations would fall victim to the moral and intellectual weaknesses in their societies. Could one really judge Nazi leaders when in one's own nation captured German prisoners of war received better treatment than black soldiers who had captured them? No. The civil rights movement was inevitable once the Nuremberg trials had taken place. The logic of national identity called for an effort to realize the reality of Christian religion on a political basis. America had no choice but to embark eventually on a quest for post Nuremberg meaning. That the civil rights movement began under the benign Eisenhower administration was an indication of the terrible conflicts in which America and its religious sensitivity would engage. If nothing else, Eisenhower personified the good citizen, the American Christian gentleman, the man to whom all good accrues because of his faithful adherence to the American credo. That Dwight D. Eisenhower was compelled by the logic of the law to order federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, over the protests of members of his party, and the South to enforce a Supreme Court decree, seems ironic yet appropriate for the unveiling of the American religious question and its resolution. It was this terrible inconsistency that many Indians sensed as they approached the civil rights movement. In attempting to distinguish Indian issues from the concerns felt by the Black community and understood by their white allies, many Indians began to discover their own culture. They began to trace out the reality of their own religious experiences and to distinguish between the technological superiority of the white man and his moral corruption and the falsity of his religious facade. It was during the Eisenhower years that some of the religious ceremonies of the tribes were first openly performed after many decades of suppression. Throughout the 1960s, the civil rights movement gained power and strength, calling millions of people to commitments that many had never considered making. One cannot but review the many martyrs of the civil rights movement, Black and white, to understand the violence of the time and many religious people's depth of commitment. From the era came writers such as Malcolm Boyd and Harvey Cox, who, in retrospect, appear as valiant pioneers discerning a break in the ecclesiastical curtain, yet committed and powerless to break out of the deteriorating situation. Their books show a desperate effort to leapfrog American domestic theology and make it speak to the times that were unfolding. The Secular City, for example, tries to impress upon the mainstream religious community the fact that secularization has all but overtaken them in a tidal wave of change. Interesting to think about. Maybe that's why I should